Hi, this is Phil Goldberg. If you're a regular listener, you're accustomed to my co-host, Dennis Ramundi, greeting you and introducing our guest, but Dennis is traveling and could not be with us today. So I'm flying solo with an honored guest, and I have to confess, a good old friend. And in the context of today's interview, the word old has many meanings. I'm here with Connie Zweig. Connie is a retired psychotherapist. She has had many roles in publishing world in the past and is known as the shadow expert because of two of her books, Meeting the Shadow and Romancing the Shadow. Oh, three, and also Meeting the Shadow of Spirituality, and also the author of A Moth to the Flame, which is based on the life of Rumi. And today, she's back with us on Spirit Matters. We interviewed her a few years ago, and now she's back because she has a new book called The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, which is just coming out, and it's a terrific book. And Connie, welcome.
Hi, Phil. Thanks for having me.
So, as I said, we interviewed you in the past, and so I would encourage our listeners and viewers to go back and listen to that one to get a deeper sense of you and your past and your spiritual history. Today, we should jump right into the subject of the book, because it might be relevant to some of our listeners. Present company included. What led to writing a book about aging and aging consciously? Give us the origin story of the new book.
Okay. Well, as I was approaching my late 60s, I was very surprised to find myself feeling disoriented. Because I've done so much emotional work with psychotherapy and shadow work, and so much spiritual work with meditation practices, I didn't expect to feel that way. But I really began to feel a lot of uncertainty and a sense of disorientation, I think is the best word for it. And part of it was due to my fantasies of retirement from clinical practice, but it was also deeper than that, because underneath retirement is, who am I if I am not that role? The shadow expert, the therapist, the writer, the grandma, the wife. Who am I if I'm not the role? And as you said, I've had many roles. So I began to read, as is my nature, and I discovered that there's very little material in the aging literature from depth psychology, which is orienting to the unconscious, which is my training, and also from contemplative practice that is non-denominational. So there are books about aging in Buddhism or aging in Christianity or aging, but not really much work that looked at both unconscious process and spiritual practice or fantasy and aspiration. So I began to think there was another book for me to write, even though I hadn't anticipated it, another contribution to make.
And so you did. And you talk about aging consciously. You talk about transitioning to a stage of life that can be disorienting. And you talk about the difference between aging and saging. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, in this early period of my own research, about 5 years ago, I found a group called Saging International, which is a community of elders that offers a year-long training to become a sage. And that's basically their name for becoming an elder. And as distinct from becoming a senior, when we have a Medicare birthday and it's kind of an automatic label change. But becoming a sage or an elder is an intentional process. And it requires inner work, emotional, cognitive, spiritual development to become an elder. It doesn't happen without our intention. It doesn't happen without our attention. And so that's really what the book became about. I loved the training from Saging International, but again, it didn't include the unconscious process, or what I call the shadows of age. And it didn't really include much about how to find spiritual practice that fits who we are now at this stage of life.
You talk a lot about, well, because you're the shadow expert, there are shadow elements in the aging process. And I'm guessing, because I do it, one of those is a kind of denial of the reality of getting old. And what can talk a bit about that, and why, what some of the other elements of shadow that enter into it as we transition to, you know, another chronological and physiological stage of life.
Okay. I was really surprised to find that a researcher at Yale, a psychologist named Becca Levy, has spent decades, her whole career, exploring how our unconscious internalized ageism actually shapes how we age. And that research fits so exactly with my work on the shadow. So if we internalize ageism throughout the lifespan, whether it's when we're kids and we're getting negative messages from parents, or at school, or we're seeing older people shamed in television shows or derogative comments in the movies, we internalize aging is bad. And what Becca Levy found was these beliefs, as they unfold through the lifespan, have an impact on our physical aging, our emotional, mental states, our cognitive capacity, even our memory. There's a correlation with memory decline. They have an impact on our longevity. If we have positive images of age in the shadow, we actually live longer. And so I was fascinated that she was able, without using the language that I used, but she called it embodied stereotypes. If we embody a negative stereotype of old age, it has an effect on every part of us. It in fact shapes how we age. So if we're in denial of age, if we're like a friend of mine who's 89 years old and said to me the other day, I don't want to be with those old people, I'm not like them. So, or all of the anti-aging advertising that we see on television with people striving to be like they were in midlife, striving to act heroically, not stop doing, not stop competing or being productive, living midlife values in late life, or buying anti-aging products, then what's happening is there's a part of us that's denying what is. Once we're in our 60s, 70s, 80s, we're not accepting who we are. In fact, we can't find self-acceptance if that internalized ageism is running the show. So, you know, with my method of shadow work, we uncover these shadows of age, and then we personify them and give them a name. So this denial process I call the inner ageist. And the inner ageist is giving us negative messages about who we are. So we actually can't move into this stage of life feeling good about ourselves.
Let me play devil's advocate for a minute. Can there also be a certain reality to this? Your friend who's 89 might in fact be healthier and more vital than other people at that age. And you and I, in fact, had a very dear mutual friend who was in a similar category and moved into an assisted living place and lasted about a week because he felt that he was surrounded by old, sick people, and he moved into an apartment where he felt better about them. So is there some reality that we age differently and that some of us, some people might retain a certain vitality and desire to accomplish new things or do new things?
So these are not mutually exclusive. The longevity revolution now means that people are living as long for as many years from retirement to death as they live from birth to college. It's a huge period of life, potentially, for a certain number of people. And that includes health and vitality. So whereas it used to be that we would reach a certain age and rapidly decline, now that decline has leveled off, and many people are living well into their 70s, 80s, even 90s. So it's not denying that we may still have capacities and aptitudes, we may still be creative, even athletic. But here's the thing, though. Late life has, Jung has a famous comment. The morning of life has a different meaning and purpose than the afternoon of life. If we carry over into the afternoon the meaning of the morning, then there's damage to the soul. So it's not that we can't do what we can do. It's that there's a different meaning and purpose now. And if we're striving in the old way, as we did in midlife, we're not going to connect with the deeper purpose, which from my point of view is to turn within and achieve a couple of tasks, developmental tasks, that are needed to become an elder and to complete our lives in peace. We won't do that. We won't give that attention if we're still concerned about looking young, acting young, being with young people only. We won't give that attention, and we won't find the treasures of this stage of life.
Talk a little bit more about that, Connie, because what would those deeper purposes be? What are the typical imperatives of being an elder?
So in all of the perennial spiritual traditions, the purpose of late life is spiritual practice and preparation for death. So for me, what I say is there are three portals. One portal to the shadow, which is the doorway to the depth within us, meeting the shadows of age, exploring the fears and concerns that are having an effect on us, whether we're aware of it or not. Then there's the portal to pure awareness, which we can call the self or the higher self or soul or pure consciousness or God within, whatever we want, through spiritual practice. And the third is mortality awareness. Because if we're denying that we're facing a limited time horizon, if we're in denial of that, a client at 67 said to me, I have all the time in the world. And his mother had just died. So he had not taken in, he had not allowed his own mortality awareness to penetrate. And he may have a lot of time. I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying the awareness that we're past midlife and we have a shortened time horizon to bring up new questions. What's most important to us now? What is our highest value? What do we need to repair? So many people tell me that this is a time for them for emotional repair. They want to give and receive forgiveness. They want to make amends with people they may have hurt or who hurt them. Other people tell me they want to do spiritual repair. You and I have been around the block here, and we know that people have been spiritually abused, traumatized, disillusioned, and they may want to do that kind of repair and ask different questions than they asked when they were first seeking in their 20s or 30s. What are those questions now?
What are those questions now? What are the
Okay, well, let's come back to that. So those are some of the tasks. And then, underneath that is, what do I need to do so that I won't die with regret? What am I leaving undone in my legacy that only I can do? And that's a task that we're not going to return to. We're not going to turn our attention to if we're still running on the treadmill of life. Okay.
Can it create a new treadmill?
Well, a slower pace treadmill, right? And the slower pace is inevitable for most of us. For some people, it's a gradual slide to changing gears. And we get sad about that. And one of the things that I've noticed as an opportunity is that slower pace opens other doors.
Mm.
So I like to say age is our curriculum. If we notice the slower pace, if we notice certain diminishments, if we notice emotional losses or physical losses, how do we use those as spiritual practices? As grist for the mill, as Ram Dass would say, to turn within and connect with something deeper.
Do you find when people ask themselves the question, if I were on my deathbed, what would I regret? Because I found myself asking myself that a few years ago. As a writer, is there any in my fantasies of things I need to write, is there anything I would actually regret not writing? And I realized I've been procrastinating about a certain thing for 25 or 30 years, and that I would regret.
Yes, so you've told me that.
Yeah, I did.
It's an important realization.
But it also creates a new kind of pressure, because now I feel I got to work on this, and it's keeping me more disciplined than I would normally be about such things. But it also creates a new kind of pressure that for some people at a certain age, you don't want that kind of pressure. So how do people reconcile, I got to get this done before it's too late, and I don't want the pressure, or I've got to see so-and-so one more time, or I've got to go on the trip I always wanted to go, but now it's, I'm too old to go. I got to do it before they need to carry me. And it could create another kind of pressure.
Right. So I had that question before I wrote this book. And I basically sat with the question for 2 years. Is this my ego? Is this my ego continuing to want to be relevant, to want to be seen, to want to be the shadow expert? Or is this a call of my soul? is this my soul saying, this is your Dharma now, this is what's being asked of you, heed the call. And I sat with that for 2 years. And what I came up with was, I'm going to write this book differently than I wrote the others. I'm not going to write it with that pressure. I'm not going to write it with obligation. I'm going to write it, I set up a schedule where I would meditate and I would write. And I would meditate and I would write. And there was a certain flow state that happened that I didn't experience with the earlier books, because I allowed myself to slow down, to turn within, to let things move through me, and to be less attached to the outcome, which is really important. I mean, this is what karma yoga is about, right? We do what we do as a practice, and we let go and we release it to the world. So for me, my intention was to write the book as an elder, not as a hero, a midlife hero, with all the kind of pushing and striving and desires. And, you know, I really tried to do it in a different rhythm. I didn't always succeed, but I would say I mostly succeeded. And there was a different experience of creativity with that, of my relationship to my psyche, you know, what I call the creative unconscious, and of my meditation practice, which included the emptying in the process before the filling up. So that's kind of what I would suggest about that, because some of us do hear a call in late life. And at my literary age, retired after being a businesswoman her whole life, and now she paints full time. And she said, I never knew I was an artist. But she's not painting like she's doing payroll. You know, she's painting with a flow, a different pace, a different relationship to time, a different relationship to herself, a different desired relationship to the outcome. And so that's my suggestion about that.
Is it easier or harder when you start to enter this stage of life consciously to achieve a more genuine non-attachment?
I think this is very individual, because there are many levels of non-attachment which kind of go with our level of consciousness or our stage of development. So there are a lot of people who have not done inner work and who age and become more rigid, more controlling. Their neuroses harden, right? And their belief systems harden, and there's less an attachment. There are other people who may feel indifferent or apathetic, and that's not the unattachment we're talking about, like particularly people who get depressed. So what we're talking about is a level of awareness that comes with inner work, and an opening out to the possibility that life unfolds without our ego's agenda. And if we're still in the experience of our ego controlling everything, then that's not going to happen. One of the breakthroughs I had was doing a life review. And I really didn't think it would be helpful to me, because I'm not oriented to the past. I kind of never look back. I'm not a nostalgic person. But I did the life review in great detail. And what I found was, and I teach how to do this in the book, And then in the book, I added the dimension of shadow. So you learn how to review your unlived life as well as your lived life. And what I found was that my life was full of magic and synchronicity and meetings with remarkable men and women. Mentors kept showing up. Joseph Campbell's whole hero's journey could actually be mapped onto my life, which blew my mind. And when I saw that, something in me let go. And it coincided with writing the book. Something in me let go of a kind of control that I've always been holding on to. Feeling we called my father master of the universe because he thought he could, control everything. And occasionally my husband Neil calls me master of the universe because my ego is just acting like nobody else can do it. I have to do it all. I'm in charge, right? And when I saw that in my life review, something released in me, and I can trust the flow of life more now, and I can observe it. I'm separate from it rather than trying to manage it. You could call it the Tao. We could call it the Tao or Dharma, whatever we call it. It's that flow that's bigger than we are.
I'm just glad you didn't call your book The Tao of Aging.
Yeah.
It would have been too cliche, but it would have fit. I would think also a kind of life review, if done properly, can lead to gratitude instead of regret and victimization. If every once in a while I look back at things and I say, man, I was really lucky, or I'm so glad that happened, and that sort of thing. Whereas habitually we often look back at the stuff we regret or are angry about.
Well, I view my most traumatic events, and I've had my share of suffering, as initiations into the shadow. And they were incredible teachings, which led me to this work that I've been doing now for 3 decades. So without those traumatic events, that wouldn't have happened.
When I see around me, people, my peers, and as we're all aging, and I see some people wanting to, those who are lucky enough not to have to worry about continuing to earn a living and financial pressure, which is a whole other category of concern for people, for many people. So we want to be careful not to just speak to the privileged who don't. But when career concerns lessen, people either want to just have a good time and do things they always wanted to do, and or make or commit to some kind of service, to make a contribution that they couldn't do earlier in life. Talk to me a bit about service, because it's an impulse of becoming an elder that I think many people have.
So, retirement from paid work is like a Rorschach test. Throughout our lives, we unconsciously project onto it what it's going to mean. I'll be free, I'll be at leisure, I can do whatever I want, I can travel, I can rest. Or we project onto it, I'll be useless, invisible, I'll be so bored with nothing to do. And retirement is a very individual experience. So if we can become aware of retirement in our shadows, the unconscious projections that we're attributing to it, And if we can become aware of the shadow character in us that's stopping us from stopping, I call it the doer or the driver, the provider, the competitor, that part of us that cannot slow down, that is going to sabotage retirement because it's our identity. I am the doer, right? I am the CEO. I am the teacher. I am the therapist, the shadow expert. If we grip that identity unconsciously, then we don't let go and slow down, change pace, and open the invitation to the new stage of life. So there's several things here. One is we're projecting onto retirement, either romanticizing it or denigrating it. And we are identified with the part of us that cannot retire because it can't stop doing. That's where all of the meaning comes from. Or we have a shadow character from childhood, like one of my clients had the useless retiree because his grandfather sat and watched TV all day long. And he said, I'll never be like that. So all of these things are going on in the shadow around retirement. What I'm trying to teach about this is that there's an opportunity to shift our identity here from role to soul, from the roles in the workplace or the roles in the family, which are changing, always changing, to a spiritual essence, a spiritual identity. I mentioned this before, the deeper reality of who we really are. And retirement opens that door. It gives us that opportunity because the doing slows down or stops. And then we ask again, who am I? If I'm not the CEO or the nurse or the mom, who am I? And that for me is a profound chance to shift our identity to something more aligned with this stage of life, a spiritual identity.
That's a good segue to what I'd like to talk about in our last several minutes together. The inevitability of illness and death and how we deal with that. For one thing, even those of us who are aging and are healthy and vital, we're dealing with the illness and death of people we care about. That becomes an increasing reality. So there's that issue. How do we deal with loss and as we age? And then it's the inevitability of our own either aching joints or more serious illness and pain as we get older, physical pain, and of course the inevitability of death. And speaking for myself as a longtime spiritual practitioner and teacher and everything, I like to think that if I'm conscious as I'm dying, I will handle it with grace. But I know that I don't know whether I will or not. What advice can you give people who are dealing with A, loss, B, the inevitability, or perhaps the reality of pain and illness and mortality?
So if we're practicing role to soul, which by the way is a term coined by Ram Dass, if we're practicing role to soul, if we're doing our meditation practice and quieting the mind and centering in our breath or mantra or prayer or whatever practice we're doing, then any activity becomes a practice. This is what I mean by age is our curriculum. So I spent 2 years as a caregiver for a friend with cancer. And what I found was I could attune to my shadow issues that were coming up by listening to my inner dialogue. I could attune to my self-observation and watch the feelings that were coming up. I could recognize myself in her, that this may well be my future. And eventually what I experienced, and we were intimate, so I was sharing a lot of this with her. And eventually what I experienced was the roles fell away. It was not caregiver and patient, or healthy person and sick person, or giver and receiver. It was soul to soul. We were two souls on a journey, and that's what we were experiencing at the moment. And it was incredibly liberating in that way. And I think that it helped me prepare to be on the other side. You know, Ram Dass once said, we go from how can I help to how can you help me? And so now when I do my meditation and my other practices, I view them in the context of impending death. This breath may be my last exhalation. How complete can I make it? I breathe in, I take in life. I breathe out, I release it. And so my meditation practice has changed in this context. There's a beautiful book called The Blossoming Lotus by Thich Nhat Hanh, which is mindfulness practices around illness and death. So for people who are interested in learning how to put your attention there and not look away, how to really be mindful about these issues, that's a beautiful book. Also, you know, Ram Dass' last book, Walking Each Other Home, I highly recommend.
And I'll tell our listeners, he wrote that with Mirabai Bush, and we interviewed Mirabai when the book came out. You can find that in our archive.
Yeah. So illness and death are a part of the cycle of life. You know, the creator and the destroyer are always already everywhere. And just as we see the leaves falling from the tree and the seeds becoming leaves again, the same thing is happening with our atoms and our cells and our molecules. And there's the life force and there's the death force. And if we begin to see that rather than take it personally, like, I don't want my Connie-ness to die. I don't want people to forget about me. I. That creates the suffering. That creates the holding on at the moment when we need to let go. And so if we begin to look at it more, I would say archetypally or impersonally, rather than it's personal, there's a shift that happens, and we come to feel more at peace with this process that's happening from the moment we're born.
Isn't there also in deep meditation practices and other deep practices, the experience of knowing we're not just our bodies, of identifying with the self that transcends physical form? And in that way, meditation has often been called a sort of dress rehearsal for death. In that when it leads to that kind of transcendence, and I'm sure you write about that as well in the book.
Yeah, so there are practices in there to learn I am not my body, I am not my mind, I am not my beliefs, I am not my story, all the stories that we tell ourselves. I am that. And whatever that means for you, that which lives and breathes through everything, or that which is divine, or that which is Gaia, or that which connects it all, whatever you want to put in there, emptiness, or shunyata, or fullness, Brahman, whatever language works, I am that. I am not this body, and I am not this Conniness. And this Conniness will be forgotten, long forgotten. Even as the books live on Amazon, my Conniness will be long forgotten. And I'm making peace with that.
Good.
I'm making peace with that now. 72 years of life experience. It's time to make peace with that.
Well, Connie, thank you for being with us. Thanks for this new contribution, which I think is terribly significant for all of us. And I would encourage our listeners who don't think of themselves as of the age where this is needed. You may be 50 or 40, but these things are going to happen. And the earlier you start to inquire, the better. You'll also be in better position if you read Connie's book to help the elders in your life. So Connie, thanks for being with us. Everybody go buy The Inner Work of Age. You'll be glad you did. And look for Connie online.
Gratitude to you, Phil.
Take good care.
Phil, that was Connie Zweig, and I should explain to our listeners and viewers on the YouTube channel that where was I in the interview? Well, I'm in Sweden, and it shouldn't be a problem, but this time, sometimes the scheduling, it's a 9-hour difference. Phil's in Los Angeles, Connie was in Los Angeles, so I didn't make the interview, but I'm here for the discussion. I'm very familiar with Connie. I'm familiar with her work. She's a good friend and a
We
wonderful
missed
person.
you.
I've heard that before. I'm not convinced of that, but it's possible. And but her new book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul. That's a great title. So Phil, tell us, what was it like today?
Well, it made me feel old. No, I'm kidding. You know, you and I both have known Connie for more than half our lives, you know,
Right.
over 45 years probably. And it was a great pleasure for me to do this because I know how much effort she put into the new book and why she wrote it. So we talked about that. And it's a relevant and important book because, you know, so many of us, and I'm sure our listeners, even our listeners who are younger than us, who are in their 30s, 40s, whatever, they are dealing with older parents and relatives and friends, people who are showing signs of aging and all that. And eventually they'll be like, you know, our generation.
If they're lucky, if they're blessed as we
they're
have,
lucky.
they will
But
see
one
that.
of the things,
period.
you know, one of the things that Connie pointed out is that because we live longer and we live longer well in general, we have more time between the usual retirement age or Medicare age and death than people any time in history.
Right.
And so how do you live those years? And how, one of the things I brought up with her is, no matter how healthy and vital we may be in our, as we age, eventually we'll have to deal with illness and pain and death. And many of us are already dealing with the illness and pain part of it. and with the death of loved ones. You know, we're at the age
Right.
where people we care about and know for a long time are starting to.
Every month or two, it seems to come up, and one deals with it. And this is very timely that you would be writing it. The gentleman we recently interviewed that wrote the book on Ram Dass certainly touches on a lot of these same points, because Ram Dass was very aware as he was entering those final years and what he was going through, and shared that. And I think it's very timely, and that for Connie's book to come out now, and especially since she was part of a generation, as were we, that thought things would go on forever. And never trust anybody over 30. That was it was one of the themes of our generation. And what do you say about that?
Well, when I turned 30, I realized how ridiculous that maxim was. And the truth is, even back in those days, hippie days of like
Nobody really,
anybody over 30, we all turned to people who were well over 30 for, to be our mentors and our guidance and all that. We may not have been, we may have been publicly arrogant in those ways, but it was people like Aldous Huxley and Joseph Campbell and Alan Watts that I was turning to in those days, and they were the older generation. So I don't think we should take those things seriously. But now I don't trust anybody over 80.
No, over 100. They say that the first 100 years are the tough ones, and then after that, it's,
There's one of Leonard Cohen's songs that I like very much. The opening line is, my hair is gray, my friends are gone, and my hair is gray. I ache in the places where I used to play. And that's as good a summary of getting older as I can imagine. And
but no, and it was and for our generation, Ginsberg and Kerouac were a little ahead of us, and they also reflect on it. And what were some of the aspects of her book that she touched upon?
She talked about the aging consciously. And Connie's an expert on the shadow and working with the shadow. She's written classic books on that subject, and as a psychotherapist has been dealing with it for a long time. And the shadow element of spirituality has been written about a lot by people like Connie. And it's especially important as we age, because we have to deal with certain unconscious elements that make us resistant to the realities of aging, that we hold stereotypes of aging that make it difficult for us to age gracefully and consciously. We are often in denial of the reality of aging. And it's also a question of being conscious of the fact that at this stage of life, you may feel productive and active and all that, but even creative work, productive work can take on a different character. And so we talked about those things and honoring the different stages of life, and the importance of not trying to be what we no longer are. And we talked about,
we see a lot of that in popular culture.
Yes, and we're victims of the feeble stereotypes of people becoming enfeebled as they age, and the desirability of youth and good looks and all those things. And it's we all look in the mirror and say, holy, who's that? you know, and if it
Right, right,
we
right,
can't
right.
do that gracefully, and if we can't, you know, a big part of spirituality is realizing we're not just our bodies and not just our personalities and not just the roles we play, as
Right.
Connie's subtitle suggests, role to soul. And so now
Yeah,
it becomes
one
a
would think,
conscious thing.
yeah.
What'd you say?
Mhm. Well, one would think that, can you hear me?
Yes.
We're having a little delay in the audio, I think. Okay. So and again, Phil's in Los Angeles and I'm in Gothenburg, Sweden. So words even take some time to travel, but it's, you know, one would think that at these stages in life, spirituality becomes even more important.
Yes.
It's something that is timeless, that is ageless. If you're told that when you're 20, it has one meaning. If you're told that when you're 100, it has another meaning, you know,
That's right.
and a meaning of greater significance. So I think, I think that those are the things that she's dealing with. And, you know, she's worked with people. I've known her, like you said, for many, many years, and she's incredibly intuitive and insightful and a great observer. And I think a lot of her writing comes from her observations and her sensibilities. You know, she's a good observer and she picks up on these things.
And a good student. She did a lot of research, you know, that goes into the book. And a lot of people write about aging, but they don't have the spiritual perspective Connie does. And for our listeners and for our friends, that's a terribly important component because, as you said, this is a stage of life where every spiritual tradition calls upon us to become to engage spiritual practice and spiritual inquiry in a new way. You know, if we're lucky, the cares and responsibility of earlier stages of life are no longer as pressing, and we don't have the excuse of being too busy.
Right.
But it becomes also more imperative because as we approach our own death and become more conscious, if we're not in denial of our mortality, and as we see our friends die, and we have to deal with loss, and as we have to deal with aches and pains, the realization of what we really are and what our true identity is becomes ever more important to become a reality and not just an idea.
Right.
So
great.
a good contribution, and I hope everybody takes advantage.
And again, the name of the book, The Inner Work of Age, Shifting from Role to Soul, S-O-U-L.
Yes.
Yeah, I look forward to reading it. Well, Phil.
Okay. All right, Dennis.
Till next
time we expect you to be present.
Yes.
And listeners, don't forget to subscribe.
Subscribe. Hit
And
that
if
red
you
button.
are so moved to help us continue this work, which we consider our service at this aging stage of life as we enter into elderhood. We would like to continue it and continue making it free, so please contribute if you can.
Yeah, go to spiritmatterstalk.com and it'll explain that. Okay, till next time.
Take care.